All right, so let's get right into it. At the very heart of Ontario's housing crisis, there's this one piece of legislation that has pretty much split the province right down the middle. It's called Bill 60, but its official name is the Fighting Delays, Building Faster Act. Now, it was brought in as a solution, but a solution for who? Well, that is the entire debate. And that really is the core conflict, isn't it? On one hand, you've got the government saying this is all about getting shovels in the ground and clearing out these massive backlogs that are hurting everybody. But on the other hand, you have tenant advocates and legal clinics looking at the exact same law and seeing something totally different. A tool that they believe will just speed up evictions and put some of the most vulnerable people at serious risk. It's two completely different stories about the very same law. So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we're going to dig into the crises that the government says it's trying to fix. Then, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of their actual plan. After that, we are going to unpack the really fierce opposition. And finally, we'll look at what's next, now that this bill is actually the law of the land. To really get a handle on Bill 60, you first have to understand the problems it was supposedly designed to fix. You know, this legislation didn't just appear out of thin air. It was a response to two huge crises that were happening in Ontario at the exact same time.
First, there's the housing and homelessness crisis, and you just can't deny it. This number, 81,500, it's just staggering. That's the number of people experiencing homelessness this year. But what's really terrifying is that this isn't some static problem. That number is a 25% jump in just 2 years. It's a crisis that is getting worse, not better. And that's the urgent, high-stakes background for a bill like this.
The second crisis is a bit more, bureaucratic, but it had incredibly real consequences for people. For years, the Landlord and Tenant Board, what we call the LTB, has just been completely overwhelmed. It was buried under this massive backlog of cases. So whether you were a tenant trying to fight an illegal eviction or a landlord who wasn't getting paid rent, your case could just be stuck in limbo for months, sometimes for years. Now, the government points to numbers like these as proof that their efforts were already working. Even before Bill 60 passed, they had doubled the number of adjudicators, and you can see the results right here. Average hearing times for some applications dropped like a rock from 38 weeks down to just 8.5. So, and this is a really crucial point in this whole debate. The government was already making huge progress on the backlog before Bill 60 was even a law. Remember that, because it becomes a big part of the critics' argument later. Okay, so with those two crises in mind, homelessness and the backlog, let's look at the government's big solution. This is where Bill 60 enters the picture. The government framed it as the next logical step, a way to cut red tape, speed up the process, and, at the end of the day, build more homes and settle disputes faster. This quote from the housing minister pretty much sums up the entire government position. Their argument has two main parts. First, they're saying, hey, don't worry, we're not touching any of the fundamental protections that tenants have. And second, they're arguing that the real solution to this whole mess is just to build more. More supply, more competition, and eventually, they say lower rents for everybody.
So what does the bill actually change? This table shows some of the biggest shifts. For starters, look at the time you have to appeal an eviction order. It's been cut in half, from 30 days down to just 15. I mean, that's barely enough time to find legal help. The time you have to pay back rent before an eviction can be filed also cut in half, from 14 days down to just 7. And check this one out. Landlords who evict a tenant to move in themselves might not have to pay any compensation anymore. And finally, tenants now have to give notice way in advance if they want to bring up new issues, like, say, a broken furnace at a hearing. Every single one of these is a major procedural change that really shifts the dynamic. Now, for every single one of those changes, there is a powerful counterargument. You've got tenant advocates, legal clinics, and opposition parties who've called this bill an outright assault on renters' rights. They argue that it fundamentally tilts the balance of power and tilts it hard in favor of landlords.
To really understand their side, you need to know this term, security of tenure. It sounds kind of technical, but it's a really simple, powerful idea. It's the legal protection that says you can't just be kicked out of your home on a whim. There has to be a legitimate legal reason. And critics argue that Bill 60 just chips away at this fundamental protection. By making everything faster and easier for landlords, they say it weakens that core principle of having a stable home.
And these points here really summarize the collective fear. Groups like the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario are basically saying these changes create an impossible situation. With less time to appeal or pay arrears, tenants just don't have a realistic chance to get legal advice or find financial help. They see a system that's no longer designed for fairness, but for speed, the speed of eviction.
And this brings us to another key idea: access to justice. It's this fundamental principle that everyone, no matter how much money you have, should be able to get a fair hearing. But critics say another new rule in the bill is a direct attack on this. It could force a tenant to pay a landlord part of the rent they allegedly owe before they're even allowed to bring up their own issues like harassment or disrepair. They see it as creating a financial barrier, basically putting a price tag on justice.
And this was not just some fringe opinion. The opposition to Bill 60 was huge, and it was organized. An open letter demanding the government just scrap the bill got signatures from 132 different organizations. We're talking legal clinics, food banks, housing advocates, a really broad coalition, all arguing that this bill would just make a really bad situation even worse.
But despite all the protests and all the warnings, the bill just kept moving forward. So, what does the future of renting in Ontario even look like now that Bill 60 is the law?
This picture, this is the government's vision. It's that simple. Their whole justification for Bill 60 is that by making the system more efficient and more predictable for landlords and for builders, they're going to encourage more rental housing to be built. And for them, that is the only real long-term solution.
But then you have this stark contrast. While the government is talking about shovels and supply chains, protesters see a much more immediate and much more devastating outcome. This quote, which was actually shouted during the final vote, it just captures the raw fear that this law will lead directly to more people losing their homes. And so on November 24th, 2025, it was a done deal. Bill 60 passed and it became law. And it's worth noting that the process itself was really controversial. The government used its majority to fast-track the legislation and limit the time for debate, which, as you can probably guess, just fueled the opposition's anger even more. So here we are, left with this one essential question. Is Bill 60 going to build the housing Ontario so desperately needs? Or is it going to dismantle the security that renters depend on to stay in their homes? The government has made its bet that a faster system will ultimately help everyone by creating more housing. But the critics, they fear that the cost of that speed will be paid by tenants, who will lose protections that have been in place for decades. The two visions could not be more different, and now, millions of Ontarians are about to find out which one becomes reality.